Hey everyone, today in my series, Grading the Avengers, we're going to be looking at some books that aren't really Avengers comics. We'll be covering Avengers Disassembled, New Avengers, Mighty Avengers, and Dark Avengers, a sort of intermission of series and teams and content that existed in between the Avengers books of the early 2000s and the early 2010s. So with all that in mind, let's begin. It's going to be a whole thing, but if you haven't seen an episode of Grading the Avengers before, you can start from the beginning by clicking on the button in the top right corner of my video at any time. Now, let's begin. Following Volume 3 of the Avengers, a volume with a lot of ups and downs I've covered over the last 3 rounds of Grading the Avengers, an interesting and kind of unprecedented thing happened to the team. With a then relatively new writer named Brian Michael Bendis taking over, the old numbering very briefly returned for a single story called Avengers Disassembled. In a pretty shocking move at the time, long-term team member Scarlet Witch began suffering a severe psychological breakdown, with her powers spiraling out of control. Over the course of 2 stories, both written by Bendis, Avengers Disassembled and House of M, both the X-Men and the Avengers as we knew them were effectively dismantled. This all took place in the fallout of Wanda's growing abilities coupled with her degrading mental state. It's a lot to unpack all at once, and I don't want to get into this one specific story too much since we're just focusing on the Avengers part here, but the effect this had on Avengers history is very significant in and of itself. Not only does Avengers Disassembled feature a great deal of characters dying in this stupid, overdramatic way that would be felt in canon for years to come, it would also mean that Wanda, one of the most sustained, permanent fixtures of Avengers history, was suddenly given this blemish of a character trait, this scar to her history with the team, I don't think is exactly fair or necessary. It certainly doesn't feel like a positive example of how to write a powerful female character. But I will defend this a little bit, saying at least this notion is up for debate, since the larger character arc of Wanda Maximoff is a story of her ultimately overcoming and triumphing over her issues. But boy, that journey, as it takes us from Avengers Disassembled all the way to Avengers vs. X-Men, when all this stuff sort of gets resolved, is a long and often very painful one. That journey is kind of what we're talking about today. During that time, a number of series cropped up, first in the form of New Avengers, also written by Bendis, and featuring a number of characters that up until now were largely excluded from the Avengers roster, specifically Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Wolverine, and Luke Cage, coupled with originals like Iron Man and Captain America returning, along with real wildcards like the Sentry kind of floating around, and we had a very fun and effective new team of Avengers that largely defined the team in the early 21st century. I really like these early days of New Avengers. The art is solid, unlike Avengers Disassembled, and the initial stories are a lot of fun. Breakout, the very first story depicting how the New Avengers came together, is genuinely inspiring and a tremendous time. It is easily one of my all-time favorite Avengers stories, and definitely buoys up my overall impression of this particular era in Avengers history. The second story is all about Wolverine in the Savage Land, and in my opinion, it also does a great job of showing how a murder-happy character like Logan can still find his place in the team with the Avengers, even with Captain America and Spider-Man and their much more strict moral codes. Yet as the series went on, it became more and more beholden to tie-in events. Instead of the team relishing in some of the valuable time spent on character development early on in the New Avengers run, most of the series is actually more like a tour guide, shuffling us lazily from one exhibit to the next. The exhibits being events like Civil War, Secret Invasion, and Dark Reign. Then everything just sort of fizzles out in a very disappointing way. My overall impression of the first volume of New Avengers is that, while it has a couple of really good stories at the beginning, too much of the rest of the series goes nowhere. And this volume overall isn't that great. That's actually why I'm grouping all these stories together. Avengers Disassembled, New Avengers, Mighty Avengers, Dark Avengers. While they each have their own individual moments, and some have better art and artists than others, most of it was written by Bendis, and all of it pretty much equals out to the same level of quality. I almost was very ready to skip right past this particular run of books. We are looking at books with just Avengers on the title, not West Coast or any other spin-off or prefix to it, since there are so many of those that I could easily do an entire series creating the Avengers spin-off books on their own. And we might do that one day. But these particular Avengers books are a little different. It's hard to call any of them full spin-offs since for a while, the New Avengers were the Avengers. There was no core Avengers team beyond that. The Mighty Avengers were created as a result of the breakup of the team following the superhero Civil War, and they too kinda considered themselves the official Avengers. Later, the Dark Avengers were the official Avengers once Norman Osborn took over S.H.I.E.L.D. for a little while. Throughout all of that, the New Avengers were still kind of around in this unofficial underground team capacity, composed of heroes not willing to play nice with the authorities as the political landscape changed. It was interesting stuff at the time, but in hindsight largely feels like it was more interesting in the ideas being floated around rather than the actual execution of them. When I focus on the actual books that are published, a huge stack of books all written by Bendis, rather than just some of these key moments that appeal to me across these books, I start to look back on this era with more sober eyes. I still think of stories like Breakout and a few other gems along the way hold up well, and are solid Avengers stories on their own. I am also mindful that this era of comics is also very important to the shape of the world of Marvel as it exists today. For better or worse, the event-heavy mindset of the time means that the team's history during this time period is very important for what's going on with them even today. Neither Steve Rogers nor Tony Stark have ever really seemed to have fully forgotten or gotten over what went down during the Civil War or the events that followed, nor should they. We learn about the Illuminati during this time, which would have huge, devastating ramifications in future Avengers books. Though I don't love Secret Invasion or Dark Reign, they do have their moments too. And it all quite nicely does lead to Siege, a Marvel event I actually like, that also brings us nicely into the next round of this series, where the Avengers were reunited, and we'll be taking a look at the 4th volume of Avengers, as written by Bendis, next time in this series. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about how great artists like David Finch and Stuart Immonen were doing awesome stuff with books like New Avengers and a couple of other stories we've talked about during this era. Both are kind of showcasing just what could be achieved in the modern age with artwork. With the benefits of computer software in full effect, these books reach a level even Avengers Volume 3 only ever kind of flirted with. While there will always be a place for classic comic book art, seeing stuff like the Savage Land drawn by these talented folks does bring the Avengers to a whole new level we really haven't seen before. However, every time we have an artist like Immonen or Finch firing on all cylinders around this era, we do have stuff like Mike Deodato and his work for the Dark Avengers. Now I like Deodato and a lot of his work elsewhere, but here he and other artists kind of feel uninspired, like they were just sort of phoning it in, or were in kind of a rush. Something's off, but I do feel that's part of the problem overall with this era of Avengers history. It suffers from a lot of bloat. It's trying different things, it's got a lot of ambitious ideas and political thoughts, but because you have people like Mark Millar or Brian Michael Bendis at the helm, they can't really quite pull it off, and instead it just leads to an excess amount of content. Perhaps it's also because at the time Marvel knew the Avengers were the only characters they still had film rights to. For whatever reason, we got a lot of comics at this time with Avengers somewhere in the title, or the team being heavily involved, a trend that would continue well after this era, come to think of it. The sheer volume of comics definitely has an effect on my overall final grade, but I think it's fair to group these all together too. There isn't much of a change in quality, so they all end up roughly in the same spot grade-wise, so with all that in mind, yes, for 2 eras in a row now, I'm doling out a C+. And since, as part of the rules we've established for grading the Avengers, I'm only giving out 2 of the exact same grade to any era, that means these are the only C+ grades to be found anywhere in grading the Avengers. Like the Chuck Austen run, I find these books very uneven. Every time there's something amazing, like Breakout, there's 5 other lackluster or outright silly stories that sort of drag it down. And even just picking out an individual series like New Avengers would have resulted in the same grade, since those books also get boring after a while. At the end of the day, Bendis just didn't quite have the energy to bring it all together on a consistent basis. So I find these books have kind of reached a sort of middle ground with me. Like Chuck Austen's era, I wouldn't really consider it average, it's just kind of very lackluster with occasional spontaneous moments of excellence. The Avengers had and would once again see better days in the future, and to their credit, between Avengers Disassembled all the way to Siege, Bendis, Millar, and the others at Marvel were clearly trying different things. Through continuing the trend of Avengers Volume 3 and trying to be more political and dark, we were able to get the Avengers in directions never seen before. I just wish we had more talented writers doing it, because at the end of the day, Bendis and Millar are just simply not as thoughtful of writers as others in the industry. But that's not the end of the story for Bendis. Like I said, he will be coming back for Volume 4, which is a whole interesting and different story. We'll be talking about that next time on Grading the Avengers.